Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical social, political, and economic liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. When Biden dropped out of the presidential race and Harris took over, we witnessed not just a change in candidate, but a change in rhetoric. Harris's campaign began talking in the language of freedom and liberty. Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, contrasted himself with the meddlesome social conservatism of JD Vance by saying he was for minding your own business. For those of us who have long championed a politics of radical liberty, this was met by both enthusiasm and suspicion. Enthusiasm, because it's good for the country to have a major party talking in those terms, especially as the GOP has abandoned anything like a commitment to political and social liberty. Suspicion because, despite all their talk, there are plenty of ways Harris and Walz want the government to get in the way of minding your own business. To talk about this shift and the opportunities it might offer to better make the case for radical liberalism, I'm joined by Joshua Eakle, co-founder and president of Project Liberal. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported project. If you like the show and want to get early access to new episodes, consider becoming a supporter. You can learn more and sign up for the free newsletter companion to this podcast by heading to reimaginingliberty.com. And stick around to the end of today's episode for a preview of my next discussion, available now in early access for supporters. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Joshua. It's striking how much the political rhetoric from the left has shifted since Kamala Harris became the first unofficial and now official nominee heading into November, and striking in a way that I think was surprising to people like you and me who have spent so much of our time in a politics of liberty, to see the Democrats, in a way that doesn't feel cynical, embrace the language that we have been using for so long to talk about we're the party of freedom, the party of liberty. Tim Walz talking about a politics of minding your own business. And we have lots of quibbles with the application of that rhetoric to the policy preferences represented by the ticket and all of the ways that they maybe are less respectful of liberty than we would like them to be. But it is fairly dramatic. What's going on there?
That is a great question, Aaron. I'm convinced, like many other political scientists, that we're in the middle of a significant political realignment across the Western world. So there's this rise of populist parties that's playing out in all these different Western countries. And there's a lot of chaos and turmoil in our political system. And there's some very odd things that are happening on both sides of the spectrum. You know, the way that I look at this is Steve Davies has spent a lot of time talking about this. And I think that a good way to frame it is the new axes of alignment between our two political poles in America, I've completely shifted over the last really 5 or 10 years. I think Kamala Harris is really one of the first people to tap into this. She's one of the first people to really effectively articulate kind of a messaging strategy that actually resonates with these kind of new forming coalitions. But really, I think at the high level, it's because we're in the middle of a political realignment. And this has been well studied, and if you want to learn more about this, I'm sure you're very well aware of the work that Steve Davies has spoken about. One of the things that he had talked about in a speech that he gave years ago, I mean, before the it was actually before the 2020 campaign, were these kind of core differences between the two poles. And these two poles are really kind of breaking down to 3 or 4 things. Openness versus closeness, whether you're kind of a cosmopolitan embrace of globalism, free trade, immigration, or nationalist, whether you embrace dynamism and innovation versus stability and order, and whether you embrace like a chosen identity or a prescribed identity. And so I think that these kind of broader shifts in society is something that just Kamala Harris has woken up to, and she's speaking to this in a way that I think is very effective. And we can get into the weeds on all the nuance around how she's doing this, because there's a variety of ways this is playing out. But it is very obviously very shocking to see. It's not what I expected, to be honest with you, and I'm not sure about you, whether you, I was kind of caught off guard by it.
I was caught off guard, I suppose, by the degree to which they went all in on it, because we'd had inklings of this kind of rhetoric, even from Biden, in the sense that his campaign was focused on Trump as an authoritarian and a direct threat to democracy and liberty, which I think is all correct. And a second Trump term would be catastrophic for liberty and prosperity. And that implies that, therefore, what we want is liberty, if Trump is a threat to it. And so that language was there, but I guess the unironic embrace of it, what I mean by that is this feels traditionally Republican to talk about liberty, and they're making American flags feature heavily in, not just in the recent convention, which as we're recording this was last week, but in their advertising and just the campaign's general iconography in a way that feels very different than before, that there's an unironic embrace of patriotism, that to reject Trumpism is patriotic. That is what feels like the strength of that, and the sense of taking back a rhetoric. I think it was Peggy Noonan after the convention was complaining that the Harris campaign had stolen Republican themes. Like there was something wrong with them using the flag and freedom and liberty because that belonged to the Republicans, which is both an interesting claim about the nature of political ideology, but also I think in Peggy Noonan's case, a knowingly cynical naivete about the current state of the Republican Party. But that was what stood out to me, was just this going all in on this language. And this is the part that is me speaking as somebody who spent his entire professional career in politics and in trying to push a politics of liberty, is how willing the Democratic base was to embrace this language as well. That it did not seem like there was a suspicion that this means that she's selling out, or that, all those American flags are a symbol that maybe she's not as committed to progressive principles as they want her to be.
Yeah.
But they were like, yes, we too are really all in on this stuff.
So the two things I'd comment on is that has been shocking to see, and I think that's there's a absolutely profound level of unity on the left right now against MAGA. It's shocking. So I mean, I think Kamala Harris has realized that her coalition is effectively secured, and so she can kind of move into what would be traditional Republican spaces rhetorically and reclaim those things without kind of alienating the left. Now there's a far left that's very that's obviously throwing up red flags about this. And I actually do want to dig into that kind of weird horseshoe theory stuff playing out, because some of those people, like we talked about, like right before we got on this podcast, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK, who many people on the left would not claim as their own, but they're also kind of joining the Trump camp. And there's this weird horseshoe theory dynamic. But I think part of the reason why that's possible is because the Republican Party has effectively moved away, not only from patriotism, they've moved so far into this cynical hatred of America, this rhetoric of America's a failed state. They've declared war. I mean, Trump is called to terminate the Constitution. The flags that I see that MAGA's flying have Trump faces all over them, or they're upside down. This is not the same Republican Party that we saw in 2016. And so really, in a way, like because the Republican parties followed Trump off of this cliff, they have opened this void in the center, both the center right and the center left, for somebody like Kamala to come in and just kind of walk all over their space and reclaim these things. Rhetorically, they have in many ways rejected American values, and they've gone to war with America. So this is a void. Now, Kamala would have been I'd say kind of stupid not to jump in and recognize that void and reclaim those symbols and put on the camo hats and put the American flags up. Those types of things are very, very smart. I saw this trajectory kind of starting under Joe Biden. I think the thing that I've been happy to see with Kamala is she's embraced kind of this more optimistic, forward-looking view rather than this idea of like doomerism and Trump is, going to destroy the country and I'm your only hope, which again, Joe Biden was leaning into some of these things before Kamala really ran with them. I'm not sure if you remember this, but Joe Biden put out an ad on Flag Day a couple months ago where he full-throated like embraced the flag and the unity of the flag. And he put it in a juxtaposition against MAGA, who, is showing pictures of them marching through the Capitol with Trump flags and Trump's faces over flags. So this is kind of a trajectory that's been playing out. But really, the only people that are to blame for this are the Republicans. Like the Republicans have completely stepped away from being proud to be an American. And it's opened this void for Kamala. And thankfully, she's kind of claimed it and walked into this space.
How unintentional do you think this was on the Republicans, from the Republicans' perspective, in the sense that if you look at the mega influencers who are posting online right now, or you listen to Trump, they're not saying, look, we have abandoned patriotism and a love of liberty and freedom in favor of all of these really wretched things.
Yeah, for sure.
They're saying the other guys are actually communists. They want to control your children and do a whole bunch of alternatively wretched things. And that's I'm not interested in the question of whether political rhetoric is authentic, because of course in a lot of cases it's not. And I'm not interested in the question of how honest these Republicans are and mainstream conservatives, because I think there's an extraordinary amount of dishonesty in all of this. But rather, what's striking to me is how surprised, you and I were surprised by this shift in rhetoric. They seem surprised not just in the shift in rhetoric, and so the kind of knee-jerk, like Peggy Noonan, they've stolen our thunder sort of thing, but also in how extraordinarily unpopular their views just became. That I think Vance played a big role in this.
Yes.
Vance elevated a certain kind of very online, right-wing person and made it clear that this is central to a lot of what the right means in this country. Now, Project 2025 elevated a lot of just how outside of the mainstream, but it feels like there's a real sense in which Republicans actually thought most of the country was on board with Charlie Kirk style rhetoric, and was shocked that as soon as someone came along and was like, hey, freedom in a positive way, and what is it they refer to Tim Walz as tonic masculinity as the alternative to toxic masculinity, real, what feels like authentic optimism and kindness, they just seem shocked that their worldview is much smaller than they had taken it to be.
There are so many examples of these terminally online campaigns where they look to this. I can't even frame it any other way than kind of this Twitter mind, where you're looking at these messaging pills. I actually think a lot of this stuff online is almost astroturfed. Like what basically a lot of the engagement that we see from these major pages are kind of pushed from, in many cases, foreign actors and other things that I think are playing an influence. We know Elon Musk is boosting some of these narratives, but I think it's this look to, it's a complete disconnect between what the actual voters in the middle America want versus what they see resonate on these kind of permanently online spaces. So, it's hard to know exactly what led to it, but I mean, there's all these examples of these really terminally online campaigns that did really well online engagement wise, and then you show up in person and they get trounced. I think Carrie Lake learned that to some degree. I think Blake Masters learned that to some degree. I think Carrie Lake's going to learn that in a big way this year again. But again, it is very, very interesting for me to. I think the key is voters are sick and tired of this oppression that is kind of over them through MAGA. It is a constant frustration and unhappiness. It's this constant belief that America is failing, that we need to return to the past. These kind of doomer narratives may work online, and Charlie Kirk might see a bunch of social media engagement, and that may be the signal that he's following, but it doesn't resonate with middle America. It doesn't resonate with most people. I mean, optimism is a much better motivator, I think, in this case. But again, it's funny to me you mentioned this, Aaron, because there was I saw, I think it was Eric Bolling from, he was a former Fox host and a Newsmax host, and he was losing his mind the other day on I think it was on a podcast where he was talking about how the left are trying to say they're the true patriots. They're wearing the camo hats. That's ours. We have to claim that. It's caught me off guard, but it's definitely caught them off guard. And I think that's the problem, is this weird, terminally online right just doesn't have the finger on the pulse with what most people want. And I think, Kamala's also got some great advisors, which is great to see.
I was thinking about the terminally online stuff in the context of journalists, because shortly after, I think it became clear she was going to take over as the nominee, and maybe it was after Tim Walz looked like a front runner, there was a New York Times op-ed columnist who wrote about, if she really wants to broaden her appeal, she'll take a harder line stance on transgender rights, because she's been a little bit too socially liberal about trans rights. And that stood out to me as, I think, an example of the terminally online. There's this sense of journalists are hanging out on Twitter still primarily, or a lot of them are. Twitter is this real right-wing echo chamber that, as I think the profound unpopularity of JD Vance demonstrates, how much Twitter was not real life, because Vance-style conservatism is much bigger in the very online right than it has turned out to be in donut shops around the country. But this sense that what America really wants is kind of more right-wing culture warring. And because that's what everybody on Twitter is talking about. That's what the columnists of the New York Times or the Washington Post seem to be talking about. And they still imagine themselves to be the originators of the national conversation, I suppose is one way to put it.
Yeah, sure.
And whereas they really, I think it's been fascinating watching how much the success of certainly her rhetoric, and it seems from the direction of the polls per campaign, I think as of right now, August 26th, it seems more likely than not that Harris is going to win in November, shows, I think, exactly that, how much the political, chattering classes, online world, campaign strategists, etc., had been part of this weird bubble. Didn't get exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, you're completely correct. And the thing that's interesting to me, again, you can't follow, definitely can't follow Twitter for normalcy. I mean, it is crazy how it seems to me in many cases so artificial. Some of the narratives that are blowing up on Twitter, it is completely disconnected from real life. I mean, the stuff you see in the algorithm now is we're headed into a civil war. The U.S. is a failed state. We've got immigrants in every major society, city ruining this. It's just very strange. But the thing that's actually really interesting to me, Aaron, is that it's actually that goes back to the kind of weird narrative we talked about. The entire pendulum has swung from 2016 to 2024. So I'm sure you remember in 2016, there were all these, the dominant conversation related to the culture war was these kind of weird blue-haired leftist stuff. It was this, this kind of attack against the people on the far left that were trying to force their pronouns on people, and this kind of idea that the SJWs were coming in and shutting down speech. I mean, that was the dominant conversation at the time. And for better or worse, those people were broadly characterized by many people as just kind of the weird people on the left that are kind of driving society in the wrong direction. And then we saw this backlash to that. It was basically what elevated Jordan Peterson and all these people in what became this kind of alt-right space. They rode the Trump wave. Trump really was a reaction to what many, this kind of online culture war against the left. The entire pendulum, I think, is swinging back in the other way right now. So you have people on the far right that really talk about how much they, they have a problem with the American tradition. They have a problem with, these immigrants. They come across as very strange. They spend all this time talking about civil war. They call it. And in modern America looks at that and goes, that is very odd. That's very, 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 very strange. And they're reacting to it, and Kamala's tapping into that. That broader line is very strange, because I do think it's like a pendulum that's swinging back and forth. And I in the same way that Trump rode that wave in 2016, I think Kamala has the ability to run that wave in 2024, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
What does all of this mean for people like you and me who care deeply about advancing a politics of liberty, who care about, like, I'm looking at those binaries from Steve Davies that you had listed at the beginning. So chosen identity versus prescribed identity, openness versus closeness, dynamism and innovation versus stability and order, and then metropolitans versus kind of failed rural areas. And the left-hand side of that just looks like liberalism. Like liberalism is it's self-authorship, or the capacity for the ability to engage in self-authorship. It is openness. It is dynamism and innovation. Liberalism doesn't really take a stance on cities versus rural, but as kind of places, cities tend to be places where self-authorship, openness, and dynamism are concentrated. But at the same time, if I look at the policies of Kamala Harris, and a lot of the policies she mentioned in her acceptance speech, or the policies of a Tim Walz, there are some things I like, but there's a lot of things I don't like, and there's a lot of things that run counter to the freedom embodied in that left-hand side of all those binaries. And so one way to read the current moment is with cynicism, that the Democrats are adopting this rhetoric, but they're the same old command and control progressives. They've always been, that in fact they're worse, that Biden was worse in a lot of these regards than, say, Bill Clinton was. They're trending in the wrong direction with the rise of the squad, and AOC was an absolute star at the DNC, and seems to be have a place in the future of the Democratic Party. And so the response is, don't fall for it. That, maybe they've taken on this language, but still the real, say, economic freedom is found, or at least more likely to be found, among Republicans still, or a progressive government is not going to give us what you and I want. The other way to read it is, no, maybe this is indicative of this realignment that you've mentioned, of a move towards cosmopolitanism versus, what was the other half of it?
Cosmopolitanism and effectively globalism, pro-immigration, pro-free trade, right?
That if that's the alignment, and this is indicative of the Democratic Party at least dipping their toes more in the good side of that alignment, then we want to be on the cosmopolitan side. Like, cosmopolitanism is simply libertarianism and radical liberalism and so on.
Right.
Which of those do you find more persuasive?
Okay, so that's a great question. And I think there's a couple things to unpack with this. So first and foremost, I think that the cultural shift that's happening, the rhetoric, presents an unprecedented opportunity for our people of our political persuasion to effectively lead a return to these values and bringing these back into the national conversation in a way that matters. I want to get into that in a second, but I will also comment on Kamala, what you'd mentioned around her kind of having this progressive baggage. A lot of people that I've read look at Kamala as kind of a cynical, pragmatist. I'm not even convinced that she has these kind of strong views one way or the other. Her ability to shift rhetorically throughout her career, it looks like, as you probably heard at the DNC, she's done this broad pivot away from progressivism. So it's unclear to me. I think that she's a politician, and so she's going to follow where the signal is, and that's not good and good at the same time. I mean, I guess if she had progressive beliefs and she'd shifted away from them, that's probably a benefit for us. But to go back to the alignment, so the old framework that we operated in before, like the Reagan fusionist era, the idea of there was this alliance between free market conservatives and libertarians. It was centered around mostly an economic agenda to combat the authoritarian left and their kind of, communist ideology. That left a lot to be desired, right? I mean, we were allied with people who had a lot of issues with our social beliefs, or like our stance on social policy. There was a lot of foreign policy disagreement. The new framework is a alignment between, effectively, the center right, these kind of many of them former Reagan Republicans. They're still culturally conservative, but they have an embrace of the free market. And cosmopolitan liberals, which are these, they kind of embrace dynamism. They embrace globalization. They embrace free markets and free trade, and they're pro-social liberty. Notably, not in that coalition are members of the far left and the far right, the collectivists on both the far left and the far right. So in this new framework, I think it presents an unprecedented opportunity for us to recontextualize cosmopolitanism, liberalism for the 21st century. And it presents a great opportunity for people that have a classical liberal persuasion to say, we are the ones that understand freedom. We are the ones that own freedom. These are the Enlightenment values that made America great. These are the ideas that you guys talk about. Here are how they apply into the real world. So I think there will be conflict between these coalitions, but I think notably, the thing that I would mention is the far left and the far right are now in the same camp. They are now kind of, that's playing out with this, I think we talked about this earlier, this kind of weird fusion between collectivists on both the far left and the far right. You see both of these extremes embracing alignment with foreign dictators. I mean, the far left loves Xi, far right loves Putin. You see protectionism and isolationism. You see identity politics and cancel culture on both these extremes. You see both of these extremes rejecting, wanting to restrict immigration for different reasons. So I think that the new coalition is presents a great opportunity for people that do have a true embrace of liberal values to say, we are the inheritors of these ideas, and there's a lot more ideological alignment. It's obviously very hard to predict how this is going to play out, but I think that in this new framework, there's a lot. I'd say there's a big opportunity for people of our persuasion to lead a significant movement that can return America to the values that we've been talking about, and you've been talking about far longer than I. And again, it's impossible to know what Kamala is going to do when she governs, and you're completely correct that there have been many policy proposals that have been problematic. But the embrace of the rhetoric is the first step, and now it's on people that kind of understand the rhetoric to contextualize it within this newly forming coalition. And there's a lot of thoughts, I think, on how that can be done, but I'm hopeful. I'm not pessimistic. I think the destruction of the old Reagan-era fusionist system is a great opportunity for us to lead a new chapter for people that care about liberalism in a meaningful way.
Yeah, you mentioned values a couple of times, and I think that's what I guess center in the conversation about this, or in my thinking about this, is, and I've written about this extensively in the past, that the issue with that old coalition was if the only point of overlap was at least a rhetoric of free markets, and I think there's a case to be made that the right's rhetorical attachment to free markets was largely just that. I think that it wasn't a principled markets are good. It was a markets create wealth. They're a way to limit the power of government, which we see as a force for social progressivism, and at least for a time, the right was controlled enough of the mechanisms of cultural power that markets weren't really a threat to it. But as markets do what they do, which is unleash social and cultural dynamism, eventually that eroded the hierarchies and power structures that the right liked. And then they turned against markets. And we've seen that with the rise of populist economics, and framed specifically on the grounds of these markets are destroying traditional ways of life. And by traditional ways of life, they simply mean a certain set of social hierarchies that they happen to like, whether that's racial or ethnic or gender or religious, whatever. And I think that the values, you're right. I think we're in a position where we have a real opportunity, not because the fact that so many Democrats now are excited about the words freedom and liberty means that they suddenly have become libertarians.
Right.
But rather because I think that when they use those terms as a value, they mean it. And the conversation is now about, hey, here's where our values overlap. And it turns out that the best way to achieve the things that you value is to really take that liberty seriously, is to really take that freedom seriously. That a lot of these policies that you're pushing, these populist policies that you're pushing, sound good. You can tell a story of how they work, but the fact is that story is false. They're not going to work. They're going to hurt the people that you're trying to help. Whereas I think the right, especially like the MAGA right, there's a genuine disconnect on the values side
100%.
of things. That it is just like they want to hurt a set of people, and the policies are directed at doing so. And you can't have a policy conversation with that because the ends are very, very different. And we've seen, I don't want to say like all conservatives are this way or everyone on the right is this way, because we've seen, or there's always been a strain of genuinely like classical liberalism within the conservative coalition. And a lot of those people have become never Trumpers. And I have some policy disagreements with a lot of them because they're more conservative than I am. Just like I have lots of policy disagreements with progressive friends. But I genuinely think that this has become in large part about values. And I also think this is why the weird thing has worked, is because the weird thing, yes, you can make jokes about couches, and yes, you can point to some odd behaviors, but ultimately I think what it is that the particular brand of weirdness among the very online right is seen as it's an ugliness. Oftentimes it's an abusiveness, a belligerence, a sneering, a dismissiveness, a desire for control over others. I'm thinking about like Richard Tanania talking about Kamala Harris's daughter and just the way that she looks, and like women with tattoos should be shunned. And like, there's just this ugliness. And I think that people are reading that as indicative of character and values, that weirdness works because the kind of weirdness people are repelled by, they're reading as a sign of a kind of moral character that they don't want ruling them. And the kind of warmth and openness and positive masculinity, say, that they see from Tim Walz, who's been the breakout star of this election season, feels like for them, this is the kind of guy, if I'm going to have someone who's in charge, this is the kind of guy I want to have in charge because I feel like I can trust him to have my interests. And then that frames the conversation as, okay, but Walz pushes some policies that aren't actually going to be good. Let's talk about that, versus who should we be directing the government to punish? Which group should have its grievances enforced at the point of a gun, and so on.
Right. And if the old framework was, we embrace markets and markets and growth, and we hate the left. The new framework is, we embrace pluralism. We're open to people that are different than us. We embrace a free market. We embrace globalization. I mean, the key is the values that underpin this newly forming coalition are far closer and more aligned with those that have a passionate embrace of liberalism than than the old axis. And I mean, when you look at the people on the other side of this new poll, the things that unite them are really a complete rejection of pluralism, a complete rejection of America's institutions, a complete rejection of it's not even growth. It's just a rejection of like having an open society. Again, unprecedented opportunity for people that actually are cosmopolitan liberals to say, look, these are how we realize those values, and having leaders that publicly embrace them, even if their policy disagreements are sometimes at odds, presents an opportunity for us to hold them accountable to those values. Because we could say, look, you have this rhetoric and your rhetoric doesn't match your action. It is definitely very, very strange though. The absolute divide, because they are reclaiming masculinity. They are really putting those that weird the values that the right has right now are it just doesn't match. So it is a weird transition period. But one of the things that I like to say when we talk about messaging going forward is we have an opportunity as liberals right now to reclaim liberalism and bring it to relevance again. In the past, this was not the conversation, right? Liberalism has long been the background noise of American politics. As much as we can disagree with many things that Reagan said or that George Bush said, they had a broad commitment to some of these liberal principles. I mean, the separation of power, the rule of law, America's institutions, freedom of speech, pluralism. I mean, I remember Reagan's last letter was a love letter to immigrants, right? When we have a political moment where liberalism is threatened like it is, and America's institutions are threatened like they are today, we can step up and clearly remind people about the values that made America great, put in a juxtaposition against the authoritarianism of both the populist far left and the far right, and bring these conversations to the forefront. And it not only presents an opportunity, it's playing out right now. There is a forming very loud and prominent intellectual coalition within the Democratic Party that is pushing for free trade and pushing for free markets. And the center right is joining in this again, kind of forming this new Never Trump coalition. So again, going back to the point, I am excited about the opportunity that it presents. But I will say that, that we should be cautious as we proceed, because we shouldn't seek a new fusionism, right? We should seek to lead a liberal coalition and a liberal movement. And not kind of embrace an alliance with, say, one of these populist fringes. But I think because of the way these new axes are playing out, that is not the case here. The populist far left and the populist far right are finally on the same team electorally, and that means that we are swimming in a pool of people that have a broad commitment to our values, and we have an opportunity to contextualize those things in a way that's very meaningful and could be very significant and make a really drastic impact on the trajectory of our country if we can, rise to the occasion as liberals.
How does this all play out, though, in the context of the two major parties? Because you mentioned, we don't want to counter fusionism. And so for listeners who don't know exactly what that term means, we mentioned a couple of times in this episode, it was the idea the libertarian movement for much of the 20th century said the way to achieving political success is to basically embed ourselves within the conservative coalition, to see conservatives as our primary allies against the Democratic or progressive coalition, and we'll convince conservatives to be libertarians, and then the conservative coalition will win out. And I, several years ago, wrote an essay about how I thought it was time to abandon fusionism, and was accused by some of advocating exactly this you just want to be in bed with the Democratic Party. And the answer is no. I want to work with, if someone is pushing pro-liberty policies, we should work with them regardless of where they are. And I think that we should be demanding of a commitment to liberty, because one of the issues is that we sometimes are like, this fusionism has meant that we're more willing to overlook, we being the liberty movement, had been more willing to overlook strong deviations from liberty if they were kind of right-wing sorts versus left-wing sorts. And I think it's part of what got us into the situation that we're in now with Trumpism taking over the party. But all of that is a long way of saying, when you talk about trying to carve out this genuine liberalism and build this coalition of it, in the United States, it seems like a significant challenge to accomplishing that is that we have two political parties that everybody knows about. Nobody knows about any of the other political parties. They exist, but they're basically irrelevant. That's not going to change. These two political parties have long rhetorical histories. Most people are not paying a lot of attention to the nitty-gritties of policy change, and so that the Republican Party's policy platform looks very different today than it did 30 years ago, most people aren't really paying attention to. They've latched onto the rhetoric around the parties. Republicans are the party of the heartland and markets and the American flag and so on, and Democrats are the parties of the cities and those weird people with blue hair and the communists and the labor unions and so on. And whether that's largely not true anymore, but it's very hard to break through to that. And there's a real just gut instinct among both the electorate and the politically engaged class that if you are seen as saying, I'm not those guys, then it means you're the other guys.
Yeah. Well, and that's a consequence of the simple fact that we live in a two-party system, which is a consequence of the fact that we have a plurality takes all, first past the post voting system, right? So at any point in time, you're going to find yourself either more aligned with one side or the other. I don't necessarily think that means we need to seek out fusionism with progressives or the far left, because I don't think that the new axis, I mean, here's my theory, and this could be completely off base. I do think that one of two things is going to happen. As this new pole forms, and there's this newly forming cosmopolitan liberal center-right coalition, it will converge on one party. I think in this moment, it's looking to be the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has transformed. It is in the midst of transforming. It has been gutted and it's lost its intellectual tradition. And in time, it will be clear to most voters that they don't really stand for the values that maybe have come to be commonplace in the minds of most voters. So I think the Republican Party will likely become the party of kind of these national collectivists, weird alliance between the far left and the far right. We're seeing this really come to terms this year. So the key thing for me is making sure that the values of the coalition that, say, make up the bulk of the Democratic Party voters are aligned with liberal values. If that's the case, then we're not necessarily seeking fusionism with progressives or the far left. We're seeking fusionism with center. We're basically seeking, guiding values that can unite a center-right, center-left coalition, kind of a centrist. Many people use the word moderate. I don't like that word very much, but you could use a moderate coalition against these kind of two extreme poles on the far left and the far right that are going to converge on another party. I don't think that's going to happen overnight, but I think that just politically, that's where the winds are blowing right now. In any political system, there will be things we disagree with. We will absolutely have policy disagreements because we have a two-party system. So the coalitions that we find ourselves in will mean that there will be policies that we don't like. But as we talked about earlier, I think the key is making sure that the broad-based values of these coalitions are aligned with, directionally going to take us where we want to go as a society. And heck, maybe they could also lead to a situation where we reform our voting system so that there is more choice, and there isn't this kind of weird duopoly style system that we have. But that's where we're at. So again, that's a pretty optimistic view of looking at the way things are. But that's not to say fusionism in the old axis with progressives. That's to say, a new coalition forming in a party that could be the Democratic Party that could absolutely move things in the right direction. I'm curious as to whether you think that's going to, if whether you agree with that assessment or not, but that's my hopeful and optimistic look forward to what could be in the next 2 decades or so.
I think you're absolutely right that if in the current environment and in the near term, at least, if there's a place for genuinely liberal ideas and values and policies, it's much more likely to be within the Democratic coalition than the Republican coalition, given the state of the Republican Party right now as the party of Trump and Kevin Robertson Heritage Foundation and JD Vance and so on, which I think has effectively no overlap with the kinds of values that are genuinely liberal and many of the policies that are genuinely liberal. I think the flip side of that is there's a decent likelihood of either the Republican Party reforming or collapsing.
Yeah.
In the sense that if Trump loses handily, one of the other features that we have seen since Trump first achieved the presidency is that Trumpism does poorly at the national level. So they've been able to take over, the Trumpists have been able to take over some school boards, although in the last round of big school board elections that their power diminished. They've been able to take over some congressional seats, a decent number of congressional seats, but by and large, the most Trumpist candidates tend to fail in larger scale elections, senatorial elections, and particularly national elections. The policies are not popular. Trump's never won the popular vote, et cetera. And I think that there's a likelihood that if Trump loses and someone else comes along and tries to inherit his mantle without his celebrity, without the imagined charisma that people saw in him, they're going to perform significantly worse than even he will or is likely to in November. And I think that you end up with a Republican Party that for quite a while, as long as it stays Trumpist, becomes more or less irrelevant at the national level and has a very hard time achieving any sort of power except for in some states. And if that's the case, either the party sits in irrelevance or the party figures out how to fix the primary system so that they can cut out the primaries right now push the most extreme people into nominations. And so I think the Democratic coalition expands in the ways you've described, but I also think the Republican coalition just has to shrink and eventually either reform or basically die, because thankfully it appears that hardcore Trumpism just doesn't have many fans. And I think it has even fewer when it's not Trump as the mouthpiece for it.
And the donors obviously aren't going to stick around in a losing proposition and keep pouring money into a machine that continues to lose. So I think you're right. My concern is that I think it's likely to go one of two ways. Either it will rethink itself and maybe moderate, although I think that's unlikely in an environment where the Democratic Party is moderating, but it could. Or it doubles down and becomes even more authoritarian and fascistic and repressive and leans into an even more intense push. I mean, I could imagine somebody, there was a tweet that went viral the other day about somebody saying that Vivek Ramaswamy is the future of the GOP, and everyone was dragging him. But I'm kind of convinced that that's probably more true than people are willing to admit. I think that let me put it this way: when you're in an environment where you're told, these people aren't going away, these voters that in the Republican Party aren't going to go away. They believe that everyone is out to get them, that all the elections are rigged against them. They're only going to get more extreme and more reactionary in a response to an environment where they continue to lose. So maybe that means those people leave the system and new voters come into the Republican Party and it moderates. But I don't think these voters are leaving. They don't have anywhere to go. So either they disengage or they stay in the Republican Party, and the Republican Party continues to go down and down and down, farther down this authoritarian reactionary rabbit hole. It's impossible to know the future, But I think it's probably going to get worse in the GOP before it gets better. And I think that as the Democratic Party moderates, it will make it less likely that the Republican Party will moderate, because people in the center are going to find themselves increasingly comfortable in the Democratic coalition, and the tent will get larger. So if the RNC is going to grow, it's going to grow on the far left extreme. It will grow with the kind of progressives, these progressives that maybe have shared policy goals like immigration restrictionism and isolationism. And, the whole Israel thing is actually a really big deal. It's a big fracture point right now on the left. Because, the narratives I see going against Zionism and all these things is something I hear from both the far right, and it's also a major fracture point on the far left. I kind of see those people migrating over in time to actually be more Republican aligned because of these new coalitions. So again, it is impossible to know, but I think the trajectory is not good. It's going to get worse before it gets better for the GOP. Whether they double down or not is unclear. I don't know. And Trump still could win, Aaron, right?
Yes,
we say not. If Trump does win, then this whole framework falls apart. I mean, it is going to get way worse.
Well, let's close with your pitch then. So imagine that someone listening to this is part of that new cosmopolitan coalition, is drawn to that kind of openness, but is skeptical of libertarianism, is skeptical of the broad sort of liberalism that we advocate for various reasons, particularly coming from a more progressive perspective, like kind of old school Democratic Party. What's your pitch to them? Not just that they should see you as sharing this coalitional goals or values, but also that they should listen to you and people like you, the kinds of liberals that we represent, more than they have in the past.
So I'll say this, and I mentioned this earlier in the show. With the realignment playing out, it presents the greatest opportunity for people of our political persuasion to lead a movement in a return to liberal values. Now, I don't think if you are in line, if you are broadly in favor of individual freedom, if you're broadly in favor of economic freedom, of political freedom and democracy, and you believe that these values are important, this presents a powerful opportunity for us to really lead the national conversation. As you may have mentioned at the beginning, I recently started an organization called Project Liberal, and the goal that we have is to make these values relevant again. We have been in a position as a society for the last 10, 15, 20 years where we have seen ascendant populist and authoritarian movements dominate the conversation. And as Americans wake up to the threats that populism poses, to the best part of the American tradition, it presents an opportunity for us to make these values relevant again and remind people why they matter. Liberalism is, I think, best understood as effectively the opposite of authoritarianism. There are many different schools of thought in the liberal tradition, but it is the idea that we should maximize individual liberty economically, politically, and socially as much as possible, and that is antithetical to authoritarian ideas. So if liberals can rise to the occasion, bring their value, remind Americans how every single thing that the United States has accomplished throughout her history, every positive thing that we've accomplished have been due to our embrace of liberal values. Those socially, it's, the abolition of slavery, it's, civil rights, economically, it's the free trade and the eradication of poverty. From an international perspective, it's the destruction of Nazism and fascism in Europe. Every single one of these things has been due to America's liberal tradition. And if we can remind Americans about why those values matter, if we can see what's coming from a political perspective and insert ourselves into that conversation in a meaningful way, we could drive America back to a return to these values, unlike what we've seen since before the Reagan era, since before World War II. And I think all the winds are in our favor to that end. So that's what excites me. That's the thing that kind of gets me going every day is this moment. It's very chaotic. It's very stressful. I have 2 young children, and I think about the future a lot. But with this great turmoil and chaos, it is a great opportunity for us to really reinvent our identity in the modern context. And so I don't think we should lose hope. I think we should be excited. And we should look to the future because liberalism is not an ideology of the past. It's not looking to something. It's not looking to the past. It's the ideology that can guide us into the future, to more prosperity than we ever imagined possible, to more peace than we ever imagined possible. And if we can rise to the occasion in this moment, I think we've got a great opportunity to do it. So that would be my high level pitch, Aaron.
Thank you for joining us today. Now, here's a preview of the next episode of Reimagining Liberty, currently in early access for supporters.
When we talk about fundamental rights, constitutional rights protections, and anti-democracy as such, that we weren't going to have a limited franchise or some other than public vote to pick whatever officers of the state we do still have, are on kind of opposite ends. And the way to think about it, when you're looking at these things as protections on liberty, is the breadth of the coalition needed. The number of people who have to solve their coordination problem in order to wield power. The constitutional amendment process and the court, including the mechanism by which the judges are indirectly appointed, so you have some political accountability, but it's also deliberately insulated from it. These are all supermajority mechanisms. These are things where you cannot, under the law, change this thing or overrule this less democratic institution unless you have a broad, under our system, bipartisan consensus on a level higher than a simple democratic majority. Whereas if you talk about the ideas of restricting the franchise or giving some people more votes or down the line, into outright autocracy, that's shrinking the breadth of the coalition you need, ultimately down to a fairly small number of people. And so that has an illiberalizing effect that is somewhat distinct from just this, do we want everything decided by 50% plus one, which is a common libertarian thing to go to, but that's really a little bit of a straw man. Nobody really wants or advocates that. When we talk about democracy, everyone understands this means liberal democracy, and both half of that term means something, that you have to have fundamental rights protected, that you have to have the rule of law and a constitutional order that is stable. And that's what we mean in the world today when we talk about democracies and we look at democracies versus the rest of the world. It's just taken for granted because everyone knows that includes the constitutional liberalism part of it, which is necessary to have any kind of meaningfully real democracy.
If you'd like to listen to that conversation right now, you can by becoming a Reimagining Liberty supporter. Head to reimaginingliberty.com and click on Early Access to learn more.